bowl of ointment slipped from Alira's hands and shattered against the stone floor before she even reached the healer's chamber. The sound echoed down the long corridor of the Blackthorn estate, and within seconds, 3 pack members rounded the corner, drawn by the noise and, worse, by the smell that rose from the broken jar. Alira dropped to her knees at once, scrambling to gather the shards, her heart pounding as heavy footsteps closed in around her. "There it is again," said a young wolf named Petra, wrinkling her nose and stepping back, as though the spilled ointment might burn her from a distance. "That smell. It follows her everywhere." Alira kept her eyes on the floor, on the broken glass, on anything that was not the 3 faces staring down at her. She had learned years ago that looking up only invited more cruelty. Her fingers, careful and quick, picked the largest pieces of glass first, ignoring the sting when one caught her palm. "Someone should tell Lord Edmund that his healer's maid is contaminating his hallways," said the second wolf, a broad-shouldered man named Callum, his arms crossed. "It's bad enough we have to smell it in the kitchens." Alira said nothing. Speaking back never helped. She had tried it once, years ago, when she was newer to the estate, and still believed that explanations mattered, that if she simply told them the ointment was medicine, made from crushed herbs and animal fat, to keep her burn scars from cracking in the cold, they might understand. They had not understood. They had laughed instead, and the laughing had stayed with her longer than any of the words. She finished gathering the glass into her apron and rose slowly, keeping her head low, keeping her scarred hands hidden beneath the fabric of her sleeves as best she could. The scars ran from her wrists to her shoulders, pale and rope-like, a permanent reminder of the night that had taken everything else from her. She had been 11 years old. She was 23 now. 9 years of scars, and 9 years of the pack's cold stares. "Move along," Callum said, though she was already moving, already slipping past them toward the servants' stairs, her bare feet quiet on the worn wooden steps. Behind her, she heard Petra mutter something about opening a window, and the sound of laughter followed her all the way down to the kitchens. The kitchens were warm, at least, and old Agatha the healer was waiting with her hands on her hips, though her expression softened the moment she saw Alira's face. "They cornered you again," Agatha said. It was not a question. "It's nothing," Alira said, setting the apron full of broken glass on the table. "I dropped the jar. I'll make more ointment tonight." Agatha studied her for a long moment, her old eyes sharp, despite the wrinkles around them. She was the only person in the entire Blackthorn estate who had never once flinched from Alira's scent, who had, in fact, spent years teaching her which herbs could ease the itching and tightness of scarred skin, which oils would keep the wounds from splitting open when the weather turned cold. Agatha had been the one to pull Alira from the wreckage of her family home 9 years ago. She had been the one to carry her, half-conscious and burned across both arms, all the way to the Blackthorn healing house, refusing to let the girl die, on a night when everyone else in the pack had simply stepped over the ash and rubble, on their way to more important matters. "You did nothing wrong," Agatha said firmly. "The ointment smells the way it does, because the herbs in it are strong enough to heal. If their noses cannot handle strong medicine, that is their failing, not yours." Alira offered a small, tired smile, the kind she had perfected over the years, the kind that showed just enough to satisfy Agatha without inviting more conversation about feelings she preferred to keep buried. "Lord Edmund said the estate needs to be ready by tomorrow." "Ready for what?" "I don't know exactly. Something important. A visitor, I think. Everyone upstairs has been in a panic all morning." Agatha's brow furrowed, and she reached for a rag to wipe down the counter, though her mind seemed elsewhere. A visitor important enough to panic the whole estate. That is unusual for Lord Edmund. He does not panic for just anyone. Alira did not think much of it at the time. Important visitors came and went from the Blackthorn territory regularly enough. Alphas from neighboring packs, traders, sometimes even members of the pack council, who oversaw disputes between territories. None of it had ever concerned her before. Not really. Because no matter who arrived, she remained exactly where she always was. In the kitchens, in the shadows, unseen by anyone who mattered, and seen too clearly by everyone who did not. She spent the rest of the afternoon peeling vegetables and scrubbing pots, her scarred hands moving through the familiar motions with practiced ease. The kitchen staff around her chattered about the visitor, throwing out guesses. Some said it was a trade envoy from the Eastern Territories. Others insisted it was someone from the council, come to settle the border dispute that had been simmering between Blackthorn and the neighboring Ashgrove pack for the better part of a year. Alira listened without joining in, content to remain invisible, which was, after all, the only way she knew how to survive in a place that had never truly wanted her. By evening, the estate had transformed. Servants rushed through every hallway carrying fresh linens and polished silver. The scent of roasting meat filled the air, thick and rich, mixing with beeswax candles and fresh-cut flowers, arranged in every corner of the great hall. Alira was kept in the kitchens, as always, chopping and stirring, and carrying trays to the doorway where other, less scarred servants would take over to actually enter the hall. It was an arrangement Lord Edmund himself had put in place years ago, though he had never said the true reason aloud. Everyone understood it anyway. Alira's scars and her scent were not fit to be seen by anyone of importance. She did not mind, not truly, not anymore. There had been a time when the exclusion cut deep, when she had cried herself to sleep wondering what was so wrong with her that an entire pack of wolves, creatures who prided themselves on loyalty and belonging, could not find even a small corner of acceptance for her. But 9 years had a way of wearing down even the sharpest pain into something duller, something she could carry without it showing on her face. It was well past sunset when Lord Edmund himself appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression tighter than Alira had ever seen it. The entire kitchen staff froze, forks and knives stilling mid-motion. Because Lord Edmund never visited the kitchens himself, he always sent a steward. "The healer's medicine tray," he said, his eyes scanning the room, until they landed on Agatha. "Our guest requires something for a wound. Immediately." Agatha wiped her hands on her apron, and moved quickly to gather what was needed. But her hands, though steady, were slower than they used to be, weakened by age and years of hard work. She glanced at Alira. "Take it to the healing house entrance," Agatha instructed, packing a small wooden case with salves and bandages. "I will follow as soon as I gather the rest. Do not enter the guest wing. Leave it at the door, and someone will collect it." Alira nodded, taking the case in both hands. It was a simple task, one she had done 100 times before for lesser injuries among the estate staff. She moved quickly through the servants' corridors, weaving past the flustered household staff, her bare feet silent against the stone, as she made her way toward the guest wing. She had never been inside the guest wing before. It was reserved for visitors of importance, and Alira had certainly never qualified as important enough to warrant an escort there, not even to deliver medicine, which was usually left with a steward at the servants' entrance. But tonight, with the entire household in chaos, no steward waited for her. The corridor outside the guest wing stood empty, torches flickering against stone walls, and somewhere beyond the heavy oak doors ahead, she could hear low voices in urgent conversation. She hesitated only a moment before pushing forward, the wooden case heavy in her arms, her mind focused entirely on completing the task and returning to the safety of the kitchens, before anyone noticed she had wandered somewhere she should not have been. She turned a sharp corner, moving quickly, her eyes fixed on the door at the end of the hall. She never saw the man walking toward her from the opposite direction, until they collided. The wooden case flew from her hands, salves and bandages scattered across the stone floor, one small jar of ointment cracking open and spilling its thick, herb-scented contents across the front of the man's tunic. Alira staggered backward, already bracing herself for the anger that was certain to follow, already rehearsing an apology in her mind, when she looked up and realized, with a jolt of pure panic, exactly who she had run into. He was taller than any man she had ever seen, broad-shouldered in a way that spoke of raw, contained strength, dressed in dark clothing that marked him as someone of significant rank, even before she noticed the heavy silver pendant at his throat, engraved with a symbol she did not recognize but instinctively understood, belonged to someone powerful. His hair was dark, his jaw sharp, and his eyes, when they finally lifted from the spilled ointment on his tunic to meet hers, were a shade of gold so pale, they seemed to glow faintly in the torchlight. Alira had never seen a stranger look at her the way this man looked at her in that moment. Not with disgust, not with the wrinkled nose and curled lips she had grown so accustomed to. He simply stared, his expression unreadable, his nostrils flaring slightly as though he were breathing in something he could not quite believe. "I am so sorry," Alira managed, already dropping to her knees to gather the fallen supplies, her hands trembling now, not from fear of punishment exactly, but from something else entirely, some instinct she could not name, that told her this collision was not an ordinary one. I wasn't watching where I was going. Please, let me clean this. The man did not move. He did not speak. He simply continued to stand there, perfectly still, watching her gather the scattered jars and bandages, with a stillness that felt heavier than any shout of anger could have been. Sir, Elira said again, glancing up at him, uncertain what else to say, uncertain why her chest felt tight beneath his gaze. I truly am sorry. I'll have this cleaned within the hour, I promise. Still, he said nothing. But something shifted in his expression, something like recognition, though Elira could not begin to guess what a stranger of such obvious importance could possibly recognize in a scarred kitchen maid kneeling before him on a cold stone floor. His eyes moved slowly over her face, then down to her arms where her sleeves had ridden up during the collision, exposing a portion of the scarring she usually kept hidden. She yanked her sleeve down quickly, her cheeks burning with a familiar shame, waiting for the inevitable step back, the wrinkled nose, the disgust she had trained herself to expect from every stranger who ever looked at her too closely. It did not come. Instead, the man knelt. He knelt directly in front of her, ignoring the ointment still soaking into his tunic, and reached out one hand, not to grab her, not to strike her, but simply to steady the wooden case she was struggling to hold as she gathered the last of the scattered bandages. His fingers brushed hers for the briefest moment, and Elira felt something pass between them that she had no words for, something warm and electric that made her breath catch in her throat. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was low and even, carrying an authority that made the question feel far more significant than its simple words suggested. "Elira," she said, barely above a whisper, unable to look away from his strange golden eyes. "I work in the kitchen, sir. I was bringing medicine for your wound." Something flickered across his face at the sound of her name, something she could not interpret. He glanced down at the small cut on his forearm, barely visible beneath his torn sleeve, a wound so minor it seemed almost absurd that an entire estate had thrown itself into chaos over it. "It is nothing," he said, his eyes returning to hers. "A scratch from the road. I do not need medicine for it." "Then why did Lord Edmund send for it so urgently?" The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close to one. "Because Lord Edmund is anxious to please me, and anxious men make hasty decisions." He rose to his feet in one smooth motion, offering her his hand. Elira stared at the offered hand for a long moment, uncertain, before finally accepting it, letting him pull her upright. His grip was firm but careful, as though he were aware of some fragility in her that she herself did not fully understand. "You should not be kneeling on cold stone," he said, releasing her hand once she was steady. "Are you injured?" "No, sir, I'm fine." She bent to retrieve the case, embarrassed to still be standing in his presence, embarrassed by the ointment stain on his clothes, embarrassed by the way her scarred wrist had been exposed, and then quickly hidden again. "I should go. I'm sorry again, for the mess." "Wait," he said, and something in his tone made her stop, despite every instinct urging her to flee back toward the safety of the kitchens. "The medicine. What is it made from?" The question surprised her. No one, not in 9 years, had ever asked her what was in the ointment that clung to her skin, and clothes, and hair, the ointment that the entire pack found so offensive. "Crushed juniper and wild sage," she said slowly, "mixed with rendered fat to keep it thick. It helps with scarring. Keeps the skin from cracking." "It smells like winter," he said, and there was something almost wondering in his voice, like frost on pine branches. Elira blinked, caught entirely off guard. No one had ever described her scent that way. No one had ever described it as anything other than foul, wrong, something to be avoided. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed from further down the corridor, and a moment later, Lord Edmund himself appeared, his face a mixture of relief and irritation, as he spotted them both standing together outside the guest wing. "Your Majesty," Edmund said, bowing low, his voice tight, with barely concealed anxiety. "I apologize for the delay. I see the kitchen girl has already brought the medicine, though it seems there was an unfortunate spill. Your Majesty." Elira's stomach dropped. She looked back at the man standing before her, really looked at him this time, at the silver pendant at his throat, at the unmistakable authority radiating from every line of his posture, and understood with sudden, breathless clarity exactly who she had been standing beside for the past several minutes. This was no ordinary visitor. This was the Alpha King himself, ruler of the Nine Packs, and she had just spilled medicine across his tunic and exposed her scarred wrist to him without a single thought for the consequences that would surely follow. "It is nothing, Edmund," the king said, his golden eyes still fixed on Alira, who felt suddenly, painfully aware of every scar on her body, every reason the pack had ever given her to feel small. The girl was simply doing her duty. Edmund's eyes flicked toward Alira with obvious disapproval, though he said nothing further in front of his royal guest. "Go back to the kitchens," he said to her, his voice sharp despite the king's presence. "You have caused enough trouble for one evening." Alira bowed her head immediately, gathering the last of the scattered bandages into the case before hurrying past both men, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain they could both hear it. She did not look back, though she felt the weight of the king's gaze following her all the way down the corridor, long after she had turned the corner and disappeared from sight. She did not know, as she fled back toward the safety of the kitchens with her pulse racing and her mind spinning, that Alpha King Draven Ashwood remained standing exactly where she had left him for several long minutes, staring down the empty corridor, breathing in the fading scent of juniper and wild sage, as though he had just been struck by something he had spent his entire life searching for, and had never truly expected to find. Nor did she know that in his chest, beneath the composed exterior of a king who had ruled the Nine Packs for over a decade without ever finding a mate, something ancient and long dormant had just stirred awake for the very first time. Alira did not sleep well that night. She lay on her narrow cot in the small servants' room she shared with two other kitchen girls, staring up at the wooden ceiling beams, replaying the collision in the corridor over and over in her mind. She could still feel the warmth of his hand around hers, still hear the low, even tone of his voice asking what her ointment was made from, still see the strange, searching look in his golden eyes when he had knelt before her instead of stepping away in disgust. It made no sense. Kings did not kneel for kitchen maids. Kings did not ask about the ingredients in medicine meant for scarred, unwanted skin. Kings certainly did not describe the scent that the entire Blackthorn pack found repulsive as something that smelled like frost on pine branches, as though it were beautiful instead of shameful. She told herself it meant nothing. He had simply been startled by the collision, distracted by his own thoughts, perhaps even amused by the absurdity of a servant girl knocking him off balance in his own borrowed hallway. By morning, she was certain he would have forgotten the entire encounter, if he even remembered her name at all. She rose before dawn, as she always did, dressing quickly in her plain gray servant's uniform and pulling her sleeves down as far as they would go over her wrists. The kitchen was already stirring by the time she arrived, the ovens lit, the morning bread rising in neat rows along the wooden counters. Agatha greeted her with a knowing look but said nothing about the previous night, only handing her a basket of vegetables to prepare for the visiting king's breakfast. "The whole estate is talking about it," whispered Nell, one of the other kitchen girls, as she kneaded dough beside Alira at the long wooden table. "They say the king asked Lord Edmund who you were, by name." Alira's hands stilled over the carrots she had been chopping. "That's not true." "It is. My cousin works in the guest wing. She said the king asked Edmund directly, right after you left, who the kitchen girl was who brought the medicine." Nell's eyes were wide with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "Edmund told him you were nobody important, just a servant with an unfortunate condition." Heat rushed to Alira's face, part embarrassment, part something else she could not name. "I'm sure he was just being polite. Kings ask questions like that all the time. It doesn't mean anything." "Maybe," Nell said, though her tone suggested she did not quite believe it. "But my cousin said he looked strange when Edmund said it, like he didn't like the answer." Alira pushed the thought away and focused on her work, chopping vegetables with more force than was strictly necessary, as though the repetitive motion could drive the memory of golden eyes and gentle hands from her mind. She had learned long ago not to hope for things that were not meant for her. Hope only led to disappointment, and disappointment, for someone already carrying as much pain as she did, was a luxury she could not afford. The morning passed in its usual rhythm, trays prepared and sent up through the servants' stairs, pots scrubbed, bread baked and cooled. Alira kept to the kitchens as she always did, grateful for the familiar work that kept her hands busy, and her mind, for the most part, occupied. It was not until midday, when she was sent to gather fresh herbs from the small garden behind the healing house, that her carefully constructed calm was disrupted once again. She was kneeling among the rows of sage and rosemary, her basket half filled, when she felt a presence behind her, a weight in the air, that made the fine hairs on the back of her neck rise. She turned, expecting perhaps Agatha or one of the other servants, and found herself instead looking up at Draven Ashwood, standing at the edge of the garden with his hands clasped behind his back, watching her with the same unreadable expression he had worn the night before. She scrambled to her feet immediately, nearly knocking over her basket in her haste. "Your Majesty," she said, bowing her head, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I didn't hear you approach." "I did not mean to startle you," he said, his voice carrying easily across the small garden. "I was told the healing house garden was empty this time of day. I wanted a moment away from the estate's endless preparations." Elira did not quite believe that explanation, though she had no reason to doubt a king's word. Something about the way he stood, the careful distance he maintained even as his eyes remained fixed on her, suggested that his presence in the garden was not entirely accidental. "I can leave, if you'd like privacy," she offered, already reaching for her basket. "No," he said, quickly enough that it surprised them both. He seemed to catch himself, softening his tone. "Stay, if you don't mind the company. I find the endless bowing and formality of the estate rather exhausting. It is a relief to speak with someone who does not seem to want anything from me." Elira did not know what to say to that. No one had ever suggested her presence was a relief before. Usually, she was the one others wished to be rid of. "I'm not sure I'm the best company, Your Majesty," she said carefully. "I don't have much to offer in the way of conversation." "You told me last night that your ointment was made from juniper and wild sage," he said, moving closer, though he kept a respectful distance between them. "Tell me more about it. How did you learn to make it?" The question, so simple and unexpected, loosened something in Elira's chest. She found herself explaining, hesitantly at first and then with growing ease, how Agatha had taught her to identify the right herbs, how she had experimented over the years to find the exact combination that eased the tightness of her scarred skin, without irritating it further. Draven listened with an attentiveness that unsettled her, his golden eyes never leaving her face, his questions thoughtful and genuine, rather than polite formalities. "You've clearly given this a great deal of thought," he said, once she had finished explaining the process. "Most people would simply endure the discomfort, rather than seek a solution." "I didn't have much choice," Elira admitted, before she could stop herself. "The scars used to crack and bleed if I didn't treat them regularly. I learned quickly, or I suffered for it." Something dark passed across the king's expression, gone as quickly as it appeared. "May I ask how you came to have them, the scars?" Elira's hands tightened around the handle of her basket. It was a question she had been asked before, though rarely with such careful gentleness, and never by anyone whose answer she actually wanted to give. Most who asked did so out of cruel curiosity, wanting the details so they could whisper them to others later, adding fuel to the rumors that already followed her through the estate. "There was a fire," she said finally, her voice quieter than before, "when I was a child. I lost my family. I was the only one who survived." Draven was silent for a long moment, and when Elira finally found the courage to look up at him, she saw something in his expression that she had never seen directed at her before. Not pity, exactly, though there was compassion in it. It looked almost like anger, restrained and carefully controlled, as though the story of a fire she had endured 9 years ago had somehow personally offended him. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "No child should have to survive something like that alone." "I wasn't entirely alone," Elira said, surprising herself with the honesty. "Agatha, the pack healer, found me. She's been kind to me ever since. The rest of the pack—" She trailed off, uncertain how much she wanted to reveal. "The rest of the pack has not been as kind," Draven finished for her, his voice tight. Elira did not confirm or deny it, though her silence spoke clearly enough. She busied herself with the herbs in her basket, uncomfortable with how easily this stranger, this king, had drawn out details of her life that she rarely shared with anyone, even the servants she had known for years. "I should return to the kitchens," she said, gathering the last of the sage. Agatha will need these for the evening preparations. Draven nodded, though he made no move to step aside as she passed him, forcing her to walk close enough that she caught, once again, the clean scent of pine, and something distinctly masculine that clung to his clothing. "Thank you for the conversation, Alira," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice sent an unfamiliar warmth through her chest. "I hope we speak again before I leave the estate." She managed only a small nod before hurrying past him, her basket clutched tightly to her chest, her mind spinning with confusion and a feeling she refused to name, because naming it would mean acknowledging a hope she had long ago trained herself never to feel. She did not see the way Draven watched her retreating figure until she disappeared through the garden gate, nor did she hear him murmur, almost to himself, words that would have changed everything had she heard them. "Frost on pine branches," he said quietly, closing his eyes and breathing in the lingering trace of her scent that remained in the garden air. "After all these years, I finally understand what that means." He had spent over a decade searching every territory within the 9 packs for a mate bond that had never once stirred, not for the daughters of powerful alphas paraded before him at countless gatherings, not for the beautiful, ambitious wolves who had thrown themselves at his feet hoping to secure a crown through marriage. He had begun to believe, as many of his advisors quietly suspected, that he was simply incapable of forming the bond, that whatever mechanism governed such connections among his kind had somehow failed to activate within him. And then a scarred kitchen maid with downcast eyes and trembling hands had collided with him in a dimly lit corridor, and the scent that rose from her skin had struck him with a force he had never experienced in his entire life, a recognition so deep and immediate that it had taken every ounce of his considerable self-control not to react openly in front of Lord Edmund and the gathered household staff. He straightened, his expression hardening into something more composed, more befitting the ruler he was expected to be. There would be time to understand what this meant, time to navigate the complicated truth that had just upended a decade of careful, controlled expectations. For now, he needed to return to the estate and continue the diplomatic negotiations that had brought him to Blackthorn territory in the first place. Negotiations that suddenly felt far less important than they had that morning. But as he walked back toward the great house, his mind remained fixed on golden brown eyes and scarred wrists hastily hidden beneath worn sleeves, and on the growing certainty that he had, quite by accident, found the one thing he had spent his entire reign searching for. The summons came just after sunset, delivered by a nervous young steward who found Alira scrubbing pots in the kitchen and told her, in a voice tight with disbelief, that Lord Edmund required her presence in the great hall immediately. Alira's stomach dropped. Servants were never summoned to the great hall unless something had gone terribly wrong, and her mind raced through every possible mistake she might have made, every rule she might have broken without realizing it. She wiped her hands quickly on her apron and followed the steward through the servants' corridors, her heart hammering with each step. When they reached the doors to the great hall, she could already hear voices inside, the low murmur of conversation punctuated by laughter that made her skin prickle with familiar dread. She recognized that particular tone of laughter. She had heard it too many times before, aimed in her direction, cruel and sharp beneath a veneer of amusement. The steward pushed open the heavy doors, and Alira stepped into a scene that made her stomach twist. The great hall was filled with pack members, gathered for what appeared to be a formal dinner in honor of the visiting king. Long tables stretched across the polished floor, laden with roasted meats and fresh bread, candles flickering in ornate holders that cast warm light across dozens of unfamiliar and familiar faces alike. At the head of the room, seated at the high table beside Lord Edmund and Lady Margaret, sat Draven Ashwood, his expression unreadable as his eyes swept across the hall and landed on Alira the moment she entered. "Ah, there she is," said a voice Alira recognized immediately, with a sinking feeling. Priscilla Blackthorn, Lord Edmund's eldest daughter, rose from her seat near the high table, a cruel smile already curling across her lips. The scarred maid herself. "Come forward, Alira. We were just discussing you." Alira froze in the doorway, every instinct screaming at her to turn and flee back into the safety of the servants' corridors. But retreating now, in front of the entire assembled pack and the visiting king, would only invite worse consequences later. She forced herself to walk forward, her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide their trembling. I understand, Priscilla continued, her voice carrying easily across the hall, that you had quite the encounter with our esteemed guest last night. Spilled medicine all over his tunic, from what I've heard. A ripple of laughter moved through the gathered crowd. You really must learn to watch where you're going, Illyra. Not everyone can tolerate your particular scent as easily as the rest of us have been forced to. Illyra said nothing, keeping her eyes on the polished floor, willing herself to remain perfectly still, perfectly silent, until this moment of public humiliation passed, as all the others had before it. Perhaps, Priscilla went on, clearly enjoying the attention of the room, we should have her demonstrate her clumsiness for our guest properly. Illyra, come here, and serve the king his wine. Let us see if you can manage it without another disaster. A steward appeared at Illyra's side, pressing a heavy silver pitcher into her hands before she could refuse. She understood immediately what was happening. This was not hospitality. This was theater, a display designed to humiliate her in front of the most important guest the estate had hosted in years, to remind her, once again, exactly where she stood within the pack's hierarchy. She had no choice but to comply. Refusing would only invite worse punishment later, when there were no witnesses to soften Lord Edmund's temper. She approached the high table slowly, the pitcher heavy in her scarred hands, her eyes fixed determinedly on the golden liquid, rather than on the faces watching her every movement. On your knees, Priscilla added, and a fresh wave of laughter rippled through the hall. It's only proper, serving someone of the king's rank. Show him the respect he deserves. Illyra's face burned with humiliation, but she lowered herself to her knees beside the high table anyway, her hands shaking slightly as she tilted the pitcher toward the king's goblet. She did not look up. She could not bear to see whatever expression Draven wore, whether disgust or amusement or simple indifference to her degradation. That's enough. The voice was quiet, but it cut through the hall like a blade, silencing the laughter instantly. Illyra froze, the pitcher still tilted in her trembling hands, wine pooling dangerously close to the rim of the goblet. Draven Ashwood had risen from his seat. The hall fell into complete silence. Even Priscilla's smug expression faltered, replaced by uncertainty, as the king's golden eyes swept across the assembled crowd, with an intensity that made several of the closest pack members shrink back in their seats. Your Majesty, Lord Edmund said quickly, rising as well, his voice tight with sudden alarm. Is something wrong? If the wine is not to your liking, I can have. The wine is fine, Draven said, his voice dangerously calm. What is not fine is watching a member of your household forced to kneel on stone floor for the entertainment of your guests. His gaze shifted to Priscilla, who had gone pale beneath his stare. I did not travel to Blackthorn territory to witness cruelty, dressed up as hospitality. The silence that followed was absolute. Illyra remained frozen on her knees, uncertain whether to move, uncertain whether this intervention would somehow make her situation worse once the king departed and the pack's true feelings resurfaced without royal witnesses present. Your Majesty, I assure you, no cruelty was intended, Lord Edmund said, his voice strained with barely concealed panic. My daughter was simply... I saw exactly what your daughter was doing, Draven interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned his attention to Illyra, and something in his expression softened immediately, though his voice remained carefully controlled. Rise, he said gently. You do not need to kneel for anyone in this hall. Illyra hesitated, uncertain, glancing quickly at Lord Edmund, whose jaw was clenched tight with obvious fury he dared not express in front of his royal guest. Slowly, she set the pitcher down and rose to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her, her face still burning with humiliation, despite the king's intervention. Thank you, Your Majesty, she managed quietly, though the words felt strange in her mouth, unfamiliar after years of being ignored, rather than defended. Draven's eyes lingered on her for a long moment before he turned back to address the rest of the hall, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. I have traveled across many territories in my years as king, he said, and I have witnessed countless customs and hierarchies among the packs I oversee. But I have never witnessed a pack that finds entertainment in humiliating one of its own. I would advise the Blackthorn pack to reconsider such practices, particularly while I remain a guest within these walls. No one spoke. Even Priscilla, whose face had gone from pale to deeply flushed with embarrassment, remained silent, unable to meet the king's gaze. Illyra, Draven said, turning back to her, his tone gentler now, though every eye in the hall remained fixed on the exchange. "You are dismissed from serving duties for the remainder of the evening. Return to your quarters and rest." She wanted nothing more than to flee the hall immediately, to escape the weight of dozens of staring eyes and the humiliation that still burned hot across her cheeks. But something made her hesitate, some instinct that told her fleeing too quickly might seem disrespectful after the king had just defended her so publicly. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said again, bowing her head briefly, before turning and walking as steadily as she could manage toward the servants' exit at the back of the hall. She did not look back, though she felt the weight of countless stares following her, some curious, some resentful, and one, she suspected, filled with an intensity she could not begin to understand. The moment she reached the safety of the servants' corridor, her composure shattered entirely. She pressed her back against the cool stone wall and slid down until she was sitting on the floor, her knees pulled up to her chest, her whole body trembling with the release of emotions she had held carefully in check throughout the ordeal. Tears she had refused to let fall in front of the pack finally spilled freely down her cheeks. She did not understand what had just happened. In 9 years of enduring the pack's cruelty, no one, not Agatha, not Lord Edmund, not a single soul within the Blackthorn territory, had ever stood before the entire household and defended her so openly. And now a king, a stranger she had known for less than a day, had done exactly that, risking the diplomatic goodwill of an important political visit to shield a scarred kitchen maid from public humiliation. It made no sense. And yet, sitting alone in the darkened corridor with tears still wet on her cheeks, Elira found herself thinking not of the humiliation she had endured at Priscilla's hands, but of the quiet, unwavering authority in Draven's voice, as he had told the entire hall that no cruelty of that sort would be tolerated in his presence. She did not allow herself to hope. Hope, she reminded herself firmly, wiping the tears from her face and forcing herself to stand, was a dangerous thing for someone like her. Kings did not fall for scarred kitchen maids. Whatever strange kindness Draven Ashwood had shown her tonight was likely nothing more than a king's sense of justice, offended by cruelty wherever he witnessed it, regardless of who the victim happened to be. She returned to her small servant's room and lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment he had risen from his seat, the moment his voice had silenced an entire hall, the moment his golden eyes had met hers with something that looked, despite every reason she had to doubt it, remarkably like tenderness. She did not know that behind the closed doors of the guest wing, Draven Ashwood was staring out his window into the darkened courtyard below, his hands braced against the stone sill, his entire body tense with restrained fury at what he had witnessed, and restrained longing for the scarred, downcast eyes that had looked up at him with such quiet gratitude. He had spent the entire dinner forcing himself to remain seated, to maintain the composed diplomatic mask expected of a king during a formal visit, even as every instinct within him had screamed to intervene the moment Priscilla forced Elira to her knees. It had taken every ounce of his self-control not to cross the hall and put an end to the display far sooner than he had. He understood now, with a clarity that unsettled him deeply, exactly how deep the pack's cruelty toward her ran, and exactly how long she must have endured it in silence, believing, as she clearly did, that she deserved no better treatment than what they had shown her. He intended to change that, whatever it cost him, whatever diplomatic complications it created with Lord Edmund and the Blackthorn pack. He was not yet certain how he would do it, nor how he would explain to his advisors and his council the sudden, overwhelming conviction that had settled into his chest the moment he first caught her scent in that dimly lit corridor. But he knew, with the same certainty that had guided every decision he had made throughout a decade of ruling the Nine Packs, that he could not leave Blackthorn territory without her. A sharp knock on the servants' room door jolted Elira awake before dawn. She sat up quickly, disoriented, her heart already racing from instinct alone, before her mind had fully caught up. Nell, sharing the small room with her, groaned and pulled her blanket over her head, muttering about servants never being allowed a full night's sleep. "Elira," came Agatha's voice through the door, tight with an urgency that pulled Elira fully awake. "You need to come now. Lord Edmund has requested you specifically." Elira dressed quickly, her mind racing through every possibility, most of them frightening. Had Priscilla convinced her father to punish her for the previous night's humiliation, once the king was no longer present to intervene? Had something happened that she was somehow being blamed for, as so often happened within the estate's rigid hierarchy? She found Agatha waiting in the hallway, her expression difficult to read. "What's happening?" Alira asked, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the early morning chill. "I don't know the full details," Agatha admitted, already walking briskly toward Lord Edmund's study, forcing Alira to hurry to keep pace. "Only that the king requested a meeting with you directly, and Lord Edmund is furious about it, though he dares not refuse a royal request." Alira's stomach twisted with a mixture of fear and something she refused to name. "Why would the king want to meet with me?" "I don't know," Agatha said again, though her sharp eyes studied Alira's face with unusual intensity. "But whatever happened in that hall last night has clearly left an impression on him. Be careful, child. Kings are not known for their patience with complications, and you have somehow become one." They reached Lord Edmund's study, to find the door already open, Edmund himself pacing anxiously near his desk, while a steward waited near the entrance. The moment he spotted Alira, his expression darkened with barely restrained irritation. "The king has requested to speak with you privately," Edmund said, his voice clipped. "I do not know what interest he has in a kitchen servant, and frankly, I do not care to know. What I care about is that you conduct yourself appropriately, and do nothing further to embarrass this household. Is that understood?" "Yes, my lord," Alira murmured, keeping her eyes lowered. "He is waiting in the eastern study. Go now, and do not keep him waiting." Alira followed the steward through unfamiliar corridors of the estate, her heart pounding with every step. She had never been summoned anywhere by anyone of importance, let alone a king, and the strangeness of the situation left her feeling as though she had wandered into someone else's life entirely, a life where scarred kitchen maids mattered enough to warrant private audiences with royalty. The eastern study was smaller than the great hall, warmed by a crackling fireplace and lined with tall bookshelves that spoke of quiet scholarship rather than political grandeur. Draven stood near the window when she entered, his back to her, his hands clasped behind him in the same posture she had noticed in the garden the previous day. "Your Majesty," Alira said softly, bowing her head. "You asked to see me." He turned, and the intensity in his golden eyes made her breath catch. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice carrying none of the formal distance she had expected. "Please, sit. There is no need to stand on ceremony here." Alira hesitated, uncertain, before lowering herself carefully onto the edge of a chair near the fireplace, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Draven remained standing for a moment longer, studying her with an expression she could not fully interpret, before finally taking the seat across from her. "I owe you an apology," he said, surprising her. "An apology, Your Majesty?" "For last night. I should have intervened sooner, before that girl forced you to your knees in front of the entire hall. I hesitated, and that hesitation cost you further humiliation." His jaw tightened slightly. "I do not make that mistake twice." Alira did not know how to respond to that. No one had ever apologized to her for failing to protect her quickly enough. Most people simply failed to protect her at all, and never thought twice about it afterward. "You don't owe me an apology," she said finally. "You didn't have to intervene at all. What you did was more than anyone else in this household has ever done." Something flickered across Draven's face, something that looked almost like pain. "How long has this been happening to you? The cruelty, I mean. Last night could not have been an isolated incident." Alira's fingers twisted together in her lap. She did not want to answer honestly, did not want to expose the full extent of 9 years of small humiliations and larger ones, the years of being treated as something less than a full member of the pack simply because of the scars she carried, and the scent that clung stubbornly to her skin. But something about the quiet sincerity in Draven's expression made her want to answer truthfully, for perhaps the first time in years. "Since the fire," she admitted quietly. 9 years. It started small, at first. People avoiding me, whispering when they thought I couldn't hear. It grew worse as I got older, though I've learned to expect it now. It doesn't affect me the way it used to." "It affects you," Draven said quietly, his eyes never leaving her face. "I could see it last night, in the way you held yourself, in the way you refused to look at anyone in that hall. That is not the behavior of someone who has learned not to be affected." That is the behavior of someone who has learned to survive being affected, which is a very different thing. Elira's breath caught. No one had ever seen through her carefully constructed composure so easily, so completely, and the accuracy of his observation left her feeling strangely exposed, as though he had reached inside her chest and laid bare something she had spent years carefully concealing. "You said there was a fire," Draven continued gently. "Would you be willing to tell me more about it? I understand, if you would rather not, but I find myself wanting to understand." Elira studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for any sign of the cruel curiosity she had learned to expect from such questions. She found none, only genuine patient interest, the kind she had not experienced from another living soul since Agatha had first taken her in 9 years ago. "It was late at night," she began slowly, the words coming with difficulty despite the years that had passed. "I remember waking up to the smell of smoke, and my mother screaming for me to get out of the house. I don't remember much after that, just running, and heat, and pain. When I finally made it outside, the whole house was already engulfed. My parents never made it out. Neither did my younger brother." Draven's expression darkened, though he remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. "Agatha found me collapsed near the tree line, burned and half-conscious. She carried me all the way back to the estate herself, though I don't remember much of that either. I woke up days later in the healing house, and she told me my entire family was gone, that I was the only one who survived." Elira's voice grew quieter still. "The pack took me in after that, out of obligation more than kindness. Lord Edmund's father was Alpha at the time, and pack law required that orphan children be cared for by the community. But no one wanted the responsibility, not really. I've simply been tolerated ever since, not welcomed." "Do you know how the fire started?" Draven asked, his voice carefully controlled, though Elira could sense a tension building beneath his composed exterior. "Officials said it was an accident. A candle left burning too close to the curtains, they claimed. No one investigated very deeply. My family wasn't important enough to warrant much attention, I suppose." Draven's hands had curled into fists on his knees, though his voice remained gentle when he spoke again. "Do you believe that explanation, that it was simply an accident?" Elira hesitated. It was a question she had asked herself countless times over the years, a doubt she had never voiced aloud to anyone, not even Agatha. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "Sometimes I wonder if there's more to it than what I was told. My father had disagreements with some of the pack elders in the months before the fire, disputes over territory boundaries. But I was only a child. I don't have any proof of anything, just a feeling that has never quite gone away." Draven was quiet for a long moment, his expression carefully neutral, though something behind his eyes suggested he was turning over information she had not intended to reveal so significant. "What was your father's name?" he asked finally. "Corwin," Elira said, surprised by the question. "Corwin Vale. Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," Draven said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I simply find myself curious about the family you lost. It seems important to understand who you were before the fire, not only who you've become since." Elira studied him carefully, uncertain whether to trust the simplicity of his explanation. There was something in his expression, some careful calculation behind the compassion, that suggested he was thinking through implications she could not yet grasp. But before she could press further, a knock sounded at the study door, and a steward entered to inform the king that the diplomatic council awaited his presence in the great hall. Draven rose reluctantly, his eyes lingering on Elira for a long moment before he turned toward the door. "Thank you for trusting me with your story," he said quietly. "I know it could not have been easy to share." "Thank you for listening," Elira replied, rising as well, uncertain what else to say. "And for what you did last night. I won't forget it." Something warm flickered across his expression before he composed himself once more, nodding briefly before departing toward his diplomatic obligations, leaving Elira alone in the eastern study, with her thoughts racing and her heart, despite every warning she gave herself, beginning to hope for something she could not yet name. She did not know that the moment Draven left the study, he summoned one of his most trusted advisors, a wolf named Callahan who had served him faithfully for over a decade, and instructed him quietly to begin investigating the details of a fire that had occurred within Blackthorn territory 9 years earlier, one that had claimed the lives of a family named Vale. Nor did she know that as Draven walked toward the Great Hall to continue his diplomatic negotiations, his mind remained fixed not on trade agreements or border disputes, but on the growing, unshakable suspicion that the fire which had destroyed Alira's family and left her permanently scarred had been no accident at all. 3 days passed, and Alira found herself caught in a strange, unfamiliar rhythm she could not fully explain even to herself. Each morning, she rose before dawn and completed her kitchen duties as she always had, scrubbing pots and chopping vegetables alongside Nell and the other servants. But each afternoon, without fail, she found some reason to cross paths with the king, whether in the healing house garden while gathering herbs, or in the quiet corridor outside the eastern study, where he seemed to spend most of his mornings in diplomatic meetings. She told herself these meetings were accidental, coincidences born from the small size of the estate's grounds and the limited paths available to a servant of her position. But she knew, deep down, that Draven sought her out as deliberately as she found herself hoping to encounter him, and the knowledge left her feeling both thrilled and terrified in equal measure. Lord Edmund had grown increasingly agitated over the pattern, though he dared not confront the king directly about his apparent interest in a kitchen servant. Instead, his frustration found its outlet in sharper commands and longer hours assigned to Alira's duties, as though additional labor might somehow discourage whatever strange fascination had taken hold of his royal guest. Priscilla, for her part, had grown colder and more venomous since the humiliation of the dinner hall, her sharp words following Alira through every corridor she dared to walk. "He's only being polite," Priscilla hissed one afternoon, catching Alira alone near the laundry room. "Kings show kindness to broken creatures sometimes. It doesn't mean anything. Don't be foolish enough to believe otherwise." Alira said nothing in response, though the words lingered painfully in her mind long after Priscilla had swept away down the corridor. She knew, rationally, that Priscilla's warning likely held more truth than she wanted to admit. Kings did not fall for scarred servants. Whatever kindness Draven had shown her was surely temporary, a passing curiosity that would fade the moment his diplomatic business concluded and he returned to his own territory, leaving her behind to face whatever consequences the Blackthorn Pact decided to impose once royal witnesses no longer watched their treatment of her. And yet, each time she found herself in Draven's presence, that rational certainty grew harder to maintain. He listened to her the way no one else ever had, asking about her days, her small joys, the herbs she loved to work with, the quiet satisfaction she found in perfecting a new remedy. He never once flinched from her scars or her scent, and more than once she caught him breathing in deeply when he thought she was not watching, an expression of quiet wonder crossing his face that she could not begin to understand. On the 4th evening of his visit, Alira was sent to deliver a tray of evening tea to the eastern study, where Draven often retreated after his long days of negotiations with Lord Edmund's council. She knocked softly before entering, finding him seated near the fireplace, a stack of parchments spread across the small table before him, his expression tired in a way she had not seen before. "Your tea, Your Majesty," she said quietly, setting the tray down carefully. "Thank you, Alira." He rubbed his temples, gesturing for her to remain rather than leave immediately. "Please, sit for a moment, if your duties allow it. I find myself in need of a distraction from these tedious negotiations." She hesitated only briefly, before settling into the chair across from him, her curiosity overcoming her usual caution. "Difficult negotiations?" "Border disputes," he said with a tired sigh. "Blackthorn and Ashgrove have been feuding over a stretch of forest land for the better part of a year, and neither side seems willing to compromise. It is exhausting, mediating between prideful alphas who care more about appearing strong than actually resolving anything." "I'm sorry," Alira said, though she was not entirely certain what comfort she could offer someone whose burdens were so far removed from her own daily struggles. "Do not apologize. Speaking with you is far more pleasant than another hour of listening to Lord Edmund's grievances." He poured himself a cup of the tea she had brought, his eyes lifting to meet hers over the rising steam. "Tell me something. Have you ever left Blackthorn territory?" The question caught her off guard. "No, Your Majesty. I've never had reason to travel, and even if I did, I don't have the means." "What would you do, if you could travel anywhere? See anything you wished?" Alira considered the question carefully, unaccustomed to being asked what she wanted, rather than what was expected of her. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I've never really allowed myself to think about it. Wanting things I can't have seems like a waste of energy better spent on more practical matters." Something in Draven's expression softened, though there was sadness in it as well. "That is no way to live," he said quietly. "Everyone deserves to want things, Alira, even things that seem impossible." "Perhaps for people whose circumstances allow for such wanting," she replied, more honestly than she had intended. "My circumstances have never been so generous." Draven set down his teacup, leaning forward slightly, his golden eyes intense in the firelight. "Circumstances can change," he said, his voice low and certain, "sometimes far more quickly than we expect." Alira did not know how to respond to the weight behind his words, the implication she was afraid to name, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. She busied herself instead with straightening the tray, uncomfortable with the intensity of his gaze, and the strange, hopeful ache blooming in her chest, despite every warning she had given herself against such feelings. "I should return to the kitchens," she said finally, rising from her chair. "Agatha will need help preparing tomorrow's remedies." Draven rose as well, though he made no move to stop her from leaving, only watching her with an expression she could not fully decipher. "Elira," he said, just as she reached the door, "thank you for your company tonight, and every evening this week. It has meant more to me than you likely realize." She turned back briefly, offering a small, uncertain smile, before disappearing through the doorway, her heart pounding with a confusing mixture of hope and fear that she carried with her long into the night. What she did not witness, as she made her way back toward the safety of the kitchens, was the moment Draven's steward Callahan slipped quietly into the eastern study only minutes after her departure, his expression grim as he closed the door firmly behind him. "You wish to see me, Your Majesty?" "What have you found?" Draven asked immediately, all traces of the gentle warmth he had shown Alira, replaced by cold, focused intensity. Callahan hesitated, glancing toward the closed door, as though wary of being overheard. "It took some careful digging, Your Majesty, given how long ago the incident occurred, but I spoke with several older members of the Blackthorn Pack who remembered the fire that destroyed the Vale family home 9 years ago." He paused, his expression darkening further. "The official records claim the fire was accidental, caused by an unattended candle, but 2 witnesses I spoke with independently mentioned seeing torches carried into the forest near the Vale property earlier that same night, well before any fire was reported." Draven's jaw tightened. Torches carried by whom? "That is where the trail grows more difficult," Callahan admitted. "No one is willing to say directly, though several names came up repeatedly during my questioning. Elder Silas Thornwood, in particular, seems to have been mentioned by more than one source as having been seen near the Vale property that night." "Silas Thornwood," Draven repeated slowly, the name settling into his memory with grim purpose. "He still serves on the Blackthorn Pack Council, does he not?" "He does, Your Majesty, one of the most senior and respected elders remaining." Draven moved toward the window, staring out into the darkened courtyard below, his thoughts racing through the implications of what Callahan had uncovered. If Alira's father had indeed been in dispute with the pack elders over territorial boundaries before his death, and if witnesses could place a senior elder near the family's home on the very night of the fire that killed them, then the tragedy that had shaped Alira's entire life, that had left her scarred and ostracized for 9 long years, may have been no accident at all, but a deliberate act of violence disguised as misfortune. "Continue investigating," Draven said finally, his voice cold with restrained fury, quietly and carefully. "I want proof before I confront anyone, proof solid enough that Silas Thornwood cannot simply deny his way out of the accusation." "Understood, Your Majesty. May I ask what you intend to do once such proof is secured?" Draven's expression hardened into something that made even his loyal advisor take an involuntary step back. "I intend to see justice done," he said quietly, "for a family who has waited 9 years for someone to finally seek the truth on their behalf." The scream tore through the estate just after midnight, jolting Alira awake with a violence that sent her heart racing, before her mind had even caught up with what was happening. She sat upright in her narrow bed, listening as footsteps pounded through the corridors above the servants' quarters, followed by raised voices and the unmistakable sound of alarm rippling through the household. Nell was already awake beside her, eyes wide in the darkness. "What's happening?" "I don't know," Elira whispered, throwing off her blanket and reaching for her shawl. "Something's wrong." They emerged into the corridor to find several other servants already gathered, whispering anxiously among themselves. One of the younger kitchen boys came sprinting down the servants' stairs, breathless with news that spread through the gathered group like wildfire. "Elder Silas Thornwood," the boy gasped out. "He's been found, in his private study, dead." A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the corridor. Elira felt a chill move through her, though she could not have explained why the news of an elder's death, someone she had barely interacted with in her 9 years at the estate, affected her so strongly. "How did it happen?" Nell asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. "No one knows for certain," the boy said, "but they're saying it wasn't natural. There's talk of poison." The corridor erupted into fresh whispers, theories and speculation flying between the gathered servants, faster than anyone could properly track. Elira remained quiet, her mind racing, though she could not shake the strange feeling that this sudden, violent death was somehow connected to the questions Draven had asked her days earlier about her father, about the fire, about the elders who had disputed territory boundaries with him before his death. She did not have long to wonder. Within the hour, the entire estate had been summoned to the Great Hall by Lord Edmund himself, his face pale and drawn as he addressed the assembled household staff and pack members with a gravity Elira had never witnessed from him before. "As many of you have already heard," Edmund began, his voice tight with barely controlled distress, "Elder Silas Thornwood was found dead in his study this evening. The circumstances of his death are being investigated, and until further notice, all members of this household are to remain within the estate grounds." Murmurs rippled through the hall, questions and fears voiced in hushed tones, as pack members exchanged uneasy glances. Elira remained near the back of the gathering, her eyes searching instinctively for Draven, finding him standing near the high table, his expression carefully composed, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested a tension that had nothing to do with grief for a fallen elder he had barely known. "His Majesty has graciously offered the assistance of his own trusted advisors in investigating this matter," Edmund continued, gesturing toward Draven. "Given the seriousness of the circumstances, and the need for a thorough, impartial inquiry." Elira watched as Draven stepped forward, addressing the hall with the same commanding presence he had shown the night he defended her from Priscilla's cruelty. "I understand this news is distressing for everyone within this household," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. "I assure you, my advisors will conduct a careful and thorough investigation. In the meantime, I ask that anyone with information relevant to Elder Thornwood's death, however small it may seem, come forward without fear of consequence." The hall remained silent, though Elira noticed several pack members exchanging uneasy glances, as though the king's request had touched on secrets they were reluctant to share openly. The gathering dispersed shortly after, servants and pack members alike retreating to their quarters with anxious whispers trailing behind them. Elira lingered near the edge of the hall, uncertain whether to return to her room or wait, some instinct urging her to seek out Draven before the night ended entirely. She did not have to wait long. A steward approached her quietly, informing her that the king requested her presence once again in the eastern study, and though exhaustion pulled at her limbs, she followed without hesitation, her mind already racing with questions she was not certain she wanted answered. She found Draven alone, standing near the fireplace, his expression heavier than she had ever seen it. He turned as she entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the evening's events hanging thick in the air between them. "You asked to see me," Elira said finally, breaking the silence. "I did." Draven gestured for her to sit, though he remained standing himself, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "I owe you an explanation, Elira, and I fear it may be difficult to hear." Her stomach twisted with dread. "What kind of explanation?" "Do you remember," he began carefully, "when I asked about your father, and the disputes he had with the pack elders before the fire that killed your family?" Elira's breath caught. "Yes. I had my advisors investigate quietly, in the days since. What they uncovered suggested that the fire which destroyed your family's home may not have been an accident, as the official records claimed." He paused, watching her carefully, as though gauging how much she could bear to hear. Several witnesses recalled seeing torches carried toward your family's property that night, before the fire was reported. And more than one source named Elder Silas Thornwood as having been present near your home that evening. The room seemed to tilt around Elira, the ground beneath her suddenly unsteady, despite the fact that she remained perfectly still in her chair. You think Silas Thornwood set the fire that killed my family? I believe it is possible, Draven said quietly. Perhaps even likely, given what my advisors uncovered. I intended to gather more concrete proof before confronting him directly, to ensure justice could be properly served, rather than simply accused. His expression darkened. But someone else appears to have reached him first, tonight, before I ever had the chance. Elira's mind reeled, struggling to process the enormity of what he was telling her. 9 years she had carried the belief that her family's death was a tragic accident, a random cruelty of fate that had left her scarred and alone through no one's deliberate malice. And now, in the span of a single conversation, that belief had been shattered entirely, replaced by the horrifying possibility that someone within the very pack that had grudgingly taken her in had deliberately murdered her entire family. Do you think his death tonight is connected? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. To what your advisors discovered? I cannot say for certain, Draven admitted. It is possible someone else within the Pack Council became aware of the investigation and chose to silence Thornwood before the truth could fully emerge. It is equally possible his death is connected to entirely different matters, and the timing is simply a cruel coincidence. His jaw tightened. I do not believe in convenient coincidences, however. Not when they align so precisely with a 9-year-old secret finally coming to light. Elira pressed her scarred hands against her face, trying to steady the storm of emotions rising within her, grief and fury and disbelief all tangled together into something she could not begin to untangle. Why would he do it? She asked, her voice cracking slightly. My father was not a powerful man. We had no wealth, no significant influence within the pack. What could my family have possibly threatened that would drive someone to murder an entire household? That, Draven said grimly, is exactly what I intend to find out. Whatever secret your father uncovered, or whatever dispute truly existed between him and the pack elders, it was significant enough that someone believed murdering an entire family was preferable to allowing the truth to surface. And now, with Thornwood dead, that same someone may believe their secret is finally safe. He knelt before her chair then, taking her trembling hands gently in his own, his golden eyes fierce with a promise she felt in the very marrow of her bones. I swear to you, Elira, I will not rest until I have uncovered the full truth of what happened to your family. Whoever is responsible, whether it was Thornwood alone or others within this pack who conspired with him, they will face justice. I give you my word as king. Elira stared down at their joined hands, at the warmth of his grip against her scarred skin, and felt something shift within her chest, some long-buried wound, beginning, cautiously, to believe that healing might finally be possible after 9 years of carrying grief and unanswered questions entirely alone. Thank you, she whispered, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what he had offered her. No one has ever fought for my family's memory before. No one has ever fought for me. That changes tonight, Draven said quietly, his thumb brushing gently across her scarred knuckles. I promise you that, Elira. Whatever else happens, that changes tonight, and it will not change back. Neither of them noticed, in that quiet, charged moment, the shadow that passed briefly across the study window outside, nor the careful, calculating eyes that watched their joined hands through the glass before retreating silently into the darkness of the estate grounds, already turning over new plans to ensure that whatever secrets had died with Silas Thornwood tonight would remain buried far more permanently than the king's investigation could ever hope to uncover. A hand closed roughly over Elira's mouth before she had even finished crossing the darkened kitchen garden, dragging her backward into the shadows between the stone wall and the tall hedges that bordered the healing house. Panic surged through her instantly, her scarred hands clawing at the arm holding her, her muffled cry swallowed entirely by the palm pressed hard against her lips. Quiet, a low voice hissed in her ear, unless you want the whole estate to know what your precious king has been digging into. Elira froze, recognizing the voice even through her terror. Cassian, the pack beta who had mocked her scent alongside Callum and Petra more times than she could count over the years, released her mouth slightly, though his grip on her arm remained bruising and tight. What do you want? she managed, her voice shaking, despite her attempt to sound steady. I want you to understand something, Cassian said, his face close enough that she could smell the sharp bite of anger radiating from him. Silas Thornwood was a friend of mine. A mentor. And 2 days after your king starts asking questions about a fire that happened 9 years ago, he turns up dead. That is not a coincidence, and I intend to find out exactly what your king thinks he knows. Elira's heart pounded violently against her ribs. I don't know anything, she said, though the lie felt weak, even to her own ears. I'm just a kitchen maid. Why would the king share investigations with someone like me? Cassian's grip tightened further, and she winced at the pressure against her scarred skin. Don't play foolish games with me. Half the estate has seen the way he looks at you, the way he seeks you out at every opportunity. If he shared anything about what he's uncovered, you would know it. Even if I did know something, Elira said, forcing steel into her voice despite her fear, I wouldn't tell you. Not after everything your friends have done to me over the years. For a moment, Cassian's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise at her defiance, quickly replaced by renewed fury. You should be careful, he said, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. Kings come and go, Elira. He'll finish his business here and return to his own territory eventually. And when he does, you'll still be here, still beneath all of us, still exactly what you've always been. Nothing. He released her arm abruptly, shoving her backward against the stone wall before disappearing into the darkness of the garden, leaving Elira alone and trembling, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She pressed a hand against the wall to steady herself, her mind spinning with the confirmation that her instincts about the shadow outside the study window had not been mere paranoia after all. Someone had been watching, and now someone knew that the investigation into Silas Thornwood's death, and the fire that had killed her family, had reached far closer to the truth than whoever was responsible had hoped. She did not sleep at all that night, curled tightly beneath her thin blanket, replaying Cassian's threats over and over in her mind. By morning, exhaustion had carved dark circles beneath her eyes, though she said nothing to Nell or Agatha about the encounter, uncertain whether speaking of it aloud might somehow invite further danger. It was Agatha, sharp-eyed as always, who noticed the faint bruising on Elira's arm as she helped prepare the morning remedies. What happened to you? The old healer asked, her voice tight with concern, as she gently examined the marks left by Cassian's grip. It's nothing, Elira said quickly, pulling her sleeve back down. I bumped into a doorframe in the dark last night. Agatha's expression made clear she did not believe the excuse for a moment, though she did not press further, only studying Elira with worried eyes for a long moment before returning to her work. You know, she said quietly, after several minutes of silence, you can trust me, Elira. Whatever is happening, whatever has changed since the king's arrival, you do not have to carry it alone. Elira's throat tightened with emotion she had not expected. In 9 years, Agatha had been the only constant source of kindness in her life, and the temptation to unburden herself of everything, the fire, the murder, Cassian's threats, Draven's promise, pressed heavily against her chest. But she thought of the shadow at the window, of Cassian's warning that someone was watching closely enough to know what secrets had been shared, and she forced herself to remain silent, unwilling to place Agatha in danger as well. I know, she said finally, offering a small, grateful smile. Thank you, Agatha, truly, but there's nothing to tell right now. She spent the rest of the morning in a state of anxious distraction, her mind replaying Cassian's threats even as her hands moved through familiar kitchen tasks. It was not until midday, when she was sent to deliver fresh linens to the guest wing, that she finally found an opportunity to speak with Draven privately, catching him just as he emerged from another round of diplomatic negotiations, his expression tired and drawn. Your Majesty, she said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else stood within earshot. I need to speak with you, privately, if possible. Something in her tone must have alerted him immediately, because his tired expression sharpened into focused concern. Of course, come. He led her into a small, empty sitting room nearby, closing the door firmly behind them, before turning to face her fully. What happened? Elira relayed the confrontation in the garden, as steadily as she could manage, though her voice trembled slightly, as she described Cassian's grip on her arm, his threats, his obvious connection to the murdered elder. Draven's expression grew darker with every word, his jaw tightening into a hard, controlled line that spoke volumes about the fury he was working carefully to contain. "He touched you," Draven said, his voice low and dangerous once she had finished, "and threatened you, because of an investigation I initiated." "It's not your fault," Alira said quickly, though the fierce protectiveness in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, despite the fear still coursing through her veins. "I should have been more careful. I shouldn't have wandered through the garden alone after dark." "You should never have to fear being harmed, simply for existing within your own home," Draven said firmly, moving closer, his hands gently cupping her face, tilting it slightly so he could examine her more closely, as though searching for any additional harm Cassian might have inflicted. "This ends now, Alira. I will not allow this pact to threaten you any further." "What are you going to do?" Draven's expression hardened with resolve. "I am going to finish what I started. My advisors have gathered enough evidence over the past several days to confirm that Silas Thornwood was involved in the fire that killed your family, likely acting alongside at least one other member of the Pack Council. Given what happened to him, I believe whoever else was involved grew fearful of the truth surfacing and silenced him before he could be questioned directly. Do you know who else was involved?" "Not yet with absolute certainty," Draven admitted. "But I have strong suspicions, and Cassian's actions last night only strengthen them. His loyalty to Thornwood, combined with his desperate need to know what I have uncovered, suggests he may know more about this conspiracy than a simple friendship would explain." Alira absorbed this information slowly, her mind still reeling from the danger she had narrowly avoided the previous night. "What happens now?" "Now," Draven said, his voice carrying the full weight of his royal authority, "I gather the Pack Council together and lay out everything my investigation has uncovered. I will not allow further delay, not when your safety is at risk." His expression softened slightly, his thumb brushing gently across her cheek. "I should have moved faster from the beginning. I underestimated how far someone within this pack might go to protect their secrets, and that miscalculation put you in danger. I will not make that mistake again." Alira leaned slightly into his touch, surprising herself with how natural the gesture felt. How safe she felt standing this close to him despite the danger still swirling around them both. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing me, for fighting for my family, when no one else ever has." Draven's expression turned fierce with quiet intensity. "I would fight for you against the entire 9 packs if it came to that. Alira, you should know that by now." The words hung heavy in the air between them, carrying a weight and meaning that neither of them dared to fully name aloud, though the truth of it burned bright and undeniable in the space separating their bodies, in the way his hands lingered against her face, in the way her breath caught and held as she searched his golden eyes for confirmation of a hope she had spent 9 years refusing to allow herself to feel. Whatever might have followed in that quiet, charged moment was interrupted by an urgent knock at the door, Callahan's voice calling through the wood with barely contained alarm. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but you must come immediately. Cassian has fled the estate grounds, and there are reports that he rode east, toward the Ashgrove border, in what appears to be a great hurry." Draven's expression shifted instantly from tenderness to cold, focused determination. "Gather my guard," he said, already moving toward the door. "If Cassian is fleeing, it means he fears exactly what I suspect he fears. We ride within the hour." He turned back briefly toward Alira, his expression torn between the urgency of the pursuit ahead and his obvious reluctance to leave her, even briefly, given the danger that had already found her once. "Stay close to Agatha until I return," he said firmly. "Do not wander the grounds alone, under any circumstances. I will send guards to watch over the kitchens while I am away." "Be careful," Alira said, surprising herself with the depth of worry evident in her own voice. Something warm flickered across Draven's expression despite the urgency of the moment. "I will return, Alira. I promise you that. And when I do, I intend to bring back the final proof needed to see justice done, for your family and for you." He left swiftly then, his footsteps echoing down the corridor as he moved to gather his guard, leaving Alira alone in the small sitting room with her heart still racing, uncertain whether the source of her racing pulse was fear for his safety, or the lingering warmth of his hands against her face, or perhaps, most confusingly of all, some tangled combination of both. 2 days passed without word from Draven, and Alira spent every waking moment consumed by anxious worry she had never expected to feel for anyone outside of Agatha's small circle of care. She threw herself into her kitchen duties with fierce determination, scrubbing and chopping and stirring, with an intensity that left her hands aching by evening, anything to keep her mind from spiraling into fear over what might have happened during the pursuit of Cassian toward the Ashgrove border. Lord Edmund had grown noticeably more subdued since the king's departure, his usual irritation replaced by an anxious wariness that suggested he understood, at least in part, the gravity of what was unfolding within his own pack council. Priscilla, too, had grown quieter, though whether from genuine concern or simple calculation regarding how the shifting political winds might affect her family's standing, Alira could not say. It was on the evening of the third day, just as the kitchen staff began preparing the evening meal, that the sound of horses thundering into the estate courtyard sent the entire household rushing toward the windows. Alira's heart leapt into her throat as she pushed through the kitchen door and out into the courtyard, ignoring Agatha's startled protest behind her. Draven dismounted first, his expression grim and travel-worn, dust and exhaustion clinging to his clothing after days of hard riding. Behind him, his guards escorted a bound and clearly defeated Cassian, his usual arrogance entirely stripped away, replaced by fearful resignation as he was pulled roughly from his horse. Draven's eyes found Alira immediately across the courtyard, and something in his exhausted expression softened with relief at the sight of her, safe and unharmed. He crossed the distance between them quickly, his hands settling gently on her shoulders as he studied her face with obvious concern. "You're safe," he said, more statement than question, though relief colored every word. "I'm fine," Alira assured him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt? What happened?" "We caught up with Cassian just before he reached Ashgrove territory," Draven said, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "He was attempting to warn someone across the border of the investigation, someone who apparently has ties to whatever conspiracy killed your family 9 years ago." Alira's stomach twisted. "Who?" Draven's expression darkened further. "Gideon Ashgrove, the current alpha of the neighboring pack, and, as it turns out, a distant cousin of Elder Silas Thornwood." He glanced toward the bound and defeated figure of Cassian, being led into the estate's holding chambers. Under considerable pressure, Cassian has confessed to a great deal. It seems the fire that killed your family 9 years ago was no accident, and no isolated act by Thornwood alone. Lord Edmund had emerged from the great hall by this point, his face pale with dawning horror as he approached the gathered group. "Your Majesty, what exactly has Cassian confessed to?" Draven turned to address both Alira and Edmund together, his voice carrying the full, cold weight of his authority. 9 years ago, your father, Corwin Vale, discovered evidence of a smuggling operation being run through Blackthorn territory, using the border dispute with Ashgrove as convenient cover for illegal trade that benefited certain members of both pack councils. Silas Thornwood was deeply involved, along with Gideon Ashgrove and several others whose names Cassian has provided under questioning. Alira felt the ground shift unsteadily beneath her feet, 9 years of unanswered questions finally beginning to resolve into a horrifying, coherent shape. "My father found out, and they killed him for it." "They killed your entire family," Draven confirmed, his voice softening with sympathy, even as fury burned clear in his eyes. "Your father intended to report the smuggling operation to the Pack Council, threatening to expose everyone involved. Thornwood decided the risk was too great to allow him to live long enough to follow through. The fire was set deliberately, meant to eliminate the entire threat your father posed, including any family members who might have known enough to continue his investigation." "They meant to kill me too," Alira said quietly, the realization settling into her chest with a weight she had not expected, despite having suspected as much from Cassian's threats days earlier. "I wasn't simply an unfortunate survivor. I was supposed to die alongside my family." "Yes," Draven said gently, his hands tightening supportively on her shoulders. "And when you survived, when the pack took you in out of obligation rather than affection, Thornwood, and those who conspired with him, made certain you were kept isolated and unwelcome, ensuring you would never grow close enough to anyone within the pack to potentially uncover the truth of what had truly happened to your family." The years of cruelty, the whispered insults, the deliberate exclusion Alira had endured since childhood, suddenly made a horrifying kind of sense that went far beyond simple prejudice against her scars and scent. The pack's coldness toward her had not been random cruelty. It had been calculated, deliberate isolation, designed to protect the secret of her family's murder for 9 long years. Lord Edmund's face had gone entirely ash-white, his hands trembling slightly as the implications of Draven's revelation settled over him. "I had no knowledge of this," he said, his voice strained. "I swear to you, Your Majesty, my father never spoke of such a conspiracy, and I certainly never suspected Thornwood of such treachery." "I believe you, Edmund," Draven said, though his tone remained coldly formal. "But your household's treatment of Alira over these past 9 years, regardless of whether it was deliberately orchestrated or simply the natural result of unchecked cruelty, is a failure that cannot go unaddressed. This pack owes her far more than tolerance and grudging obligation." Edmund's throat worked visibly as he struggled to formulate a response, though Alira barely heard whatever he eventually managed to say, her mind still reeling from the full weight of everything Draven had revealed. 9 years of grief, 9 years of unanswered questions, 9 years of believing herself somehow deserving of the pack's coldness. All of it had been built upon a foundation of deliberate lies and calculated cruelty, designed to bury a truth that had finally, at long last, come to light. "What happens to them now?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Gideon Ashgrove, and whoever else was involved? Gideon will face the full judgment of the Pack Council," Draven said firmly. "I have already sent word to the 9 Pack's governing assembly, demanding a formal tribunal to address not only the smuggling operation, but the murder of your family, and the attempted murder that left you scarred as a child. Justice has been delayed 9 years too long, Alira. It will not be delayed any further." Tears welled in Alira's eyes, though for the first time in longer than she could remember, they were not tears of grief or humiliation, but something closer to relief, the overwhelming release of a burden she had carried silently for nearly a decade, believing she would never truly understand why her family had been taken from her, why the pack had treated her survival as an inconvenience rather than a blessing. Draven's hands moved gently from her shoulders to cup her face, his thumbs brushing tenderly across her cheeks to catch the tears that had begun to fall freely. "It is over," he said softly, his voice carrying a promise she felt in the very core of her being. "The truth is finally known, and those responsible will answer for what they have done. Your family's memory has been honored, at long last." Around them, the courtyard had fallen into stunned silence, the assembled household staff and pack members absorbing the enormity of what had just been revealed, watching as their king held the scarred kitchen maid they had mocked and excluded for 9 long years with a tenderness that left no room for doubt about the depth of his feelings toward her. Alira did not know, in that moment, standing in the courtyard with tears streaming down her face and Draven's gentle hands cradling her cheeks, that the revelation of her family's murder was only the beginning of the transformation that awaited her. That within days the entire hierarchy of the Blackthorn Pack would be forced to reckon with the truth of their treatment toward her, and that the man standing before her, the Alpha King who had risked diplomatic complications and his own royal reputation to seek justice on her behalf, was preparing to make a declaration that would change the entire course of her life forever. The entire Blackthorn estate had gathered in the courtyard by mid-morning, summoned by an urgent command from Lord Edmund that no one, servant or pack member alike, was permitted to miss. Alira stood near the edge of the crowd beside Agatha, uncertain why she too had been specifically requested to attend, her stomach tight with nervous anticipation as she watched Draven emerge from the estate's main entrance, dressed formally, in dark royal colors, his expression carrying the same commanding authority she had witnessed the night he defended her in the Great Hall. Behind him walked several members of his personal guard, along with 2 pack council members Alira did not recognize, their expressions grim and purposeful. Lord Edmund stood near the front of the gathered crowd, his posture stiff with obvious anxiety about whatever was about to unfold. "Members of the Blackthorn Pack," Draven began, his voice carrying easily across the silent courtyard. 9 years ago, this pack suffered a tragedy that was never properly investigated, never properly understood. A family was murdered, their home burned to conceal the truth of what had been done to them, and the sole survivor of that tragedy was left to endure nearly a decade of cruelty and exclusion within the very community that should have protected her. A murmur rippled through the crowd, many eyes turning toward Alira, who stood frozen beside Agatha, her cheeks burning under the sudden weight of so many stares. "That survivor is Alira Vale," Draven continued, "daughter of Corwin Vale, whose murder, along with his wife and young son, was orchestrated by Elder Silas Thornwood and Alpha Gideon Ashgrove to conceal an illegal smuggling operation that Corwin had discovered and intended to expose." The murmur grew louder, shock and disbelief rippling through the gathered household. Alira caught sight of Petra and Callum near the edge of the crowd, their faces pale with the dawning realization of what their years of casual cruelty toward her had actually meant, what quiet suffering they had contributed to without ever understanding the true circumstances behind her scars. "I have spent the past several days gathering testimony and evidence sufficient to bring formal charges before the 9-Pack's governing assembly," Draven continued, his voice hardening. "Gideon Ashgrove has already been detained by his own pack council upon learning of these revelations, and a formal tribunal will convene, within the month, to determine full accountability for this conspiracy and its consequences." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd before settling, deliberately and pointedly, on Priscilla, who stood near her father with her face drained of color, and on Callum and Petra, whose earlier arrogance had entirely evaporated beneath the weight of the king's revelation. "But justice for a 9-year-old murder is only part of what must be addressed here today," Draven said, his voice growing quieter, though no less commanding. "For 9 years, this pack has treated Alira Vale with contempt and exclusion, mocking her scars and her scent, forcing her into servitude and humiliation, when she should have been embraced as a child who survived unspeakable tragedy and deserved every comfort and protection this community could offer." He turned then, moving through the crowd toward where Alira stood beside Agatha, the gathered pack members parting silently to allow his passage. Alira's heart pounded violently as he approached, uncertain what was about to happen, uncertain why every instinct within her screamed that this moment was about to change everything. Draven stopped before her, his golden eyes soft despite the formal weight of the occasion, and slowly, deliberately, he knelt. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled crowd. No one had ever witnessed an Alpha King kneel before anyone, let alone a scarred kitchen maid the entire pack had spent years treating as beneath their notice. He reached for her hands gently, turning them palm up to reveal the pale, rope-like scarring that ran along her wrists and forearms, scars she had spent 9 years hiding beneath long sleeves, ashamed of what the pack had taught her to believe was ugly and shameful. "These scars," Draven said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard, "are not marks of shame. They are proof of survival, proof of strength that few among us could ever hope to match. Alira Vale endured a fire that killed her entire family, and she has spent 9 years enduring the cruelty of a community that should have honored her survival instead of punishing her for it." He lifted her wrist gently, and before the eyes of the entire gathered pack, pressed a slow, reverent kiss against the scarred skin. Alira's breath caught entirely, tears welling in her eyes as he continued, moving to her other wrist, pressing another gentle kiss against the marks there as well, his golden eyes never leaving hers even as gasps and murmurs rippled through the stunned crowd around them. "The scent that this pack has mocked for 9 years, Draven continued, rising slowly to his feet, though he kept her hands held gently within his own, is not a flaw to be hidden or apologized for. It is the scent of my true mate, the bond I searched over a decade to find, and never expected to discover in a corridor outside a guest wing, spilled across my tunic by a woman too kind and too humble to understand her own worth." The courtyard fell utterly silent, the weight of his words settling over the gathered crowd with a force that left even Priscilla speechless, her earlier cruelty now standing exposed before the entire pack as the shameful mockery it had always truly been. "Alira," Draven said, turning fully toward her now, his expression open and vulnerable, in a way she had never witnessed from him before. "I know this is sudden, and I know the customs of formal courtship typically require more time and ceremony than we have shared. But I cannot, in good conscience, leave this estate without declaring what I know to be true. You are my mate, chosen not by chance or convenience, but by whatever force governs such bonds among our kind. I would be honored, more honored than I have ever been, by anything in my entire reign, if you would consider becoming my queen." Alira stared at him, tears streaming freely down her cheeks now, the weight of 9 years of loneliness and exclusion, colliding with the overwhelming, impossible reality of what he was offering her. She thought of every cruel whisper, every wrinkled nose, every moment she had been forced to believe herself unworthy of love or belonging, and found, standing before this man who had knelt before her and kissed her scars in front of the very pack that had mocked them, that she could no longer hold on to the shame she had carried for so long. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, her voice growing steadier with each word. "Yes, I will." The courtyard erupted into a mixture of stunned silence and scattered applause, though Alira barely registered the reaction of the crowd around her, entirely focused on the warmth in Draven's golden eyes, as he pulled her gently into his arms, his relief and joy palpable in the way he held her, as though he had spent his entire reign waiting for exactly this moment, without ever knowing it. Behind them, Lord Edmund stood frozen, his expression a complicated mixture of shock and dawning understanding of just how thoroughly his household's treatment of Alira would now be scrutinized by the very governing assembly that oversaw all 9 packs. Priscilla had gone entirely pale, her earlier cruelty now certain to follow her for the rest of her life, a permanent stain on her reputation within a pack that would soon answer to their future queen. But Alira, held safely within Draven's arms for the first time as his declared mate, found she cared little for the reactions rippling through the crowd around her. For the first time in 9 long years, she felt something she had almost forgotten how to recognize. She felt as though she finally belonged. 6 months passed before Alira found herself standing in a grand chamber within Draven's own royal territory, her reflection staring back at her from a tall mirror framed in gold, dressed in a gown unlike anything she had ever imagined wearing in her entire life. The pale blue silk flowed elegantly around her, and for the first time since childhood, her sleeves were cut short, leaving her scarred arms fully visible without a single trace of shame coloring her expression. Agatha stood beside her, adjusting the delicate circlet resting atop Alira's carefully arranged hair, tears glistening in the old healer's eyes, as she studied the transformation before her. "Your mother would be so proud," Agatha said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Whatever happened to her, wherever her spirit rests, she would be so proud of the woman you've become." Alira reached for Agatha's weathered hand, squeezing it gently. "I wouldn't have survived any of this without you. Not the fire, not the years after, not any of it. You saved my life twice over, Agatha. First when you carried me from the wreckage, and again when you insisted I was worth saving at all." The old healer's composure finally broke, tears spilling freely down her weathered cheeks as she pulled Alira into a careful embrace, mindful of the elaborate gown and carefully arranged hair. "You were always worth saving, child. I only wish this pack had understood that sooner." The tribunal, held 3 months after Draven's public declaration in the Blackthorn courtyard, had delivered swift and thorough justice. Gideon Ashgrove had been stripped of his position as Alpha and exiled from the 9 packs entirely, his territory placed under careful oversight until new leadership could be established. Several other pack council members implicated in the smuggling operation and the conspiracy to murder Alira's family had faced similarly severe consequences, their names forever marked with the shame of what they had done. Cassian, whose testimony had ultimately proven crucial in unraveling the full conspiracy, had been shown a measure of mercy in exchange for his cooperation, though he had been permanently stripped of any position of authority within the Blackthorn pack, and sentenced to years of labor in service to the very community he had helped to deceive. Lord Edmund, though not directly implicated in the original conspiracy, had faced his own reckoning for the culture of cruelty his household had fostered against Alira for 9 long years. Under the governing assembly's judgment, the Blackthorn pack had been required to establish formal protections for orphaned and vulnerable pack members, protections that would bear Alira's name for generations to come, ensuring that no child within Blackthorn territory would ever again suffer the isolation and neglect she had endured. Priscilla's public humiliation had followed her for months afterward, her reputation within pack society permanently tarnished by her cruelty toward the very woman who would soon become queen of the 9 packs. Though Alira harbored no desire for personal revenge against her former tormentor, she had found a quiet, unexpected satisfaction in watching Priscilla finally understand the weight of consequences that cruelty could carry. A soft knock at the chamber door pulled Alira from her memories, and she turned to find Draven standing in the doorway, dressed in formal royal attire, his golden eyes widening slightly at the sight of her in her wedding gown. "You look," he began, then paused, seeming to search for words adequate to the moment. "You look like everything I never allowed myself to hope for." Alira crossed the room toward him, no longer hesitant, no longer uncertain of her place in his presence. 6 months of courtship and growing love had erased the anxious uncertainty that once colored every interaction between them, replaced instead by a comfortable, deep affection that had only strengthened with each passing day. "I have something for you," Draven said, reaching into his formal coat and withdrawing a small wooden box. He opened it carefully to reveal a delicate silver bracelet, its surface etched with an intricate pattern of pine branches dusted with frost. "It reminded me of you," he explained softly, lifting it gently to clasp around her scarred wrist, no longer hidden beneath long sleeves, but displayed proudly for the world to see. "The scent that led me to you, frost on pine branches, I wanted you to carry a reminder of that moment, always." Alira studied the delicate bracelet against her scarred skin, the silver catching the light beautifully against the pale, rope-like marks that had once brought her nothing but shame and exclusion. Now, surrounded by a man who had knelt before an entire pack to kiss those same scars, who had fought tirelessly to uncover the truth behind her family's murder, who had chosen her, scars and all, as his queen, those marks felt entirely different against her skin. They felt like proof, exactly as Draven had told the Blackthorn pack all those months ago, of survival and strength rather than shame. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes glistening with emotion, "for everything. For seeing me when no one else would. For fighting for my family when everyone else had long forgotten them. For loving me exactly as I am." Draven cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing across her cheek in a gesture that had become achingly familiar over the past 6 months. "You gave me far more than I ever gave you, Alira. You gave me a reason to believe the mate bond I had long since given up hoping for was real after all. You gave me purpose, beyond simply ruling territories and settling disputes. You gave me love, real and honest and entirely unexpected, exactly when I needed it most." The ceremony that followed, held in the grand courtyard of Draven's royal estate before representatives from every territory within the 9 packs, was unlike anything Alira could have imagined during her years of quiet servitude within the Blackthorn kitchens. Wolves who had once wrinkled their noses at her scent now bowed their heads respectfully as she passed, understanding fully now the significance of the bond she shared with their king. As Draven slipped a formal mating mark against the curve of her neck, sealing their bond before the assembled crowd, Alira felt 9 years of loneliness and pain finally settle into something manageable, something that no longer defined her entirely, but had instead become simply one chapter within a much larger, far more hopeful story. She thought of her parents, of her younger brother, of the family she had lost so violently 9 years ago, and found, for the first time since the fire that had changed everything, that she could remember them without overwhelming grief consuming every other feeling. Justice had been served on their behalf. Their memory had finally been honored, not with mockery and exclusion, but with truth and, ultimately, with love. As the ceremony concluded and cheers rose from the assembled crowd, Draven pulled Alira into his arms, his golden eyes bright with a happiness that mirrored the joy blooming within her own chest. "My queen," he murmured softly, just for her to hear. "My king," she replied, smiling up at him with a warmth she had never expected to feel again after the fire had taken everything from her. Together, they turned to face the cheering crowd, no longer a scarred and mocked kitchen maid, and a king, searching desperately for a bond he had feared he would never find, but partners, equals, bound together by love that had survived cruelty, uncovered buried truth, and ultimately triumphed over 9 long years of pain neither of them would ever have to face alone again. The scars that had once marked Alira as an outcast now marked her as something else entirely, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal, that even the most broken pieces of a shattered life could be gathered together again into something whole, something beautiful, something finally, deeply loved.